Are the president of the United States and the vice president engaging in a good cop, bad cop type of negotiation with Russia over the ending of the Ukraine-Russia war? Or is there just a change of venue? Is there a shifting of where the negotiations are going to go? Those are questions that are on everybody's mind right now because of a report out in the Wall Street Journal today where there was an interview with Vice President J.D. Vance, who is in Munich right now at the Munich Security Conference to represent the United States. And there's the threat of sanctions and possible military action, at least the way the headline was written today. And in fact, when we go to some of the things that were said inside there, Gary, if you could put that call out one up, it's interesting that Vance is seeming to put something on the table that hadn't been there before. According to the article, Vance said that the U.S. could pursue a range of measures, including giving President Trump ample negotiating flexibility with Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. There are economic tools of leverage, the vice president said. There are, of course, military tools of leverage, end quote, the U.S. could use against Putin, Vance said. There's a whole host of things that we could do, but fundamentally, I think the president wants to have a productive negotiation, both with Putin and with Zelensky. The question is going to be, what leverage is he talking about there with the military tools? We understand about sanctions, and a lot of people have been talking about that, and I think that that's going to go nowhere. If anybody thinks that sanctions are going to somehow cause Russia to change course, I think they're going to be sadly mistaken. If there's anything that we've seen over the last 3 years is that Russia has pretty much made their economy sanctions-proof. We've had just tons of sanctions on Russia for many, many years, and just adding a couple more now, it just has virtually no chance to have any impact. I think it would just cause Russians to be puzzled as to why anyone would think that's going to happen. And yet, those are some of the comments that are coming out there. Now, one of the more interesting things about Vice President Vance is what he didn't say. So everybody was waiting for his speech at the Munich Security Conference today. And the expectation was, and a lot of the reports were, that he was going to say something about the outlines of the deal that the United States wanted to achieve with the ending of the war. Instead, he said literally nothing. In fact, he spent the entire speech talking primarily about democracy and freedom of speech and a bunch of other things in Europe, claiming that the biggest threat to Europe was not Russia, was not China, but things on the inside. And that by itself was pretty noteworthy. If you're saying that, here it is for the Munich Security Conference, and you're saying that the biggest threat isn't Russia, which is pretty much the default position of virtually everybody else that's there, then that just is a big signal to what the United States is going to do. So Vance seems to be putting on the table that some kind of military leverage. I don't understand what that even means in context. Obviously, we're not talking about American putting any troops in Ukraine. That was ruled out by the Secretary of Defense a couple of days ago. President Trump has also clearly indicated he wants the war to end. He doesn't want to escalate it or expand it. Definitely doesn't want to get the United States inside of it. So what that would mean is really unclear. There was, however, another American person there who was much more explicit in trying to play a really bad cop. And one wonders if this is Senator Lindsey Graham freelancing or if this is part of the negotiating team. I don't have visibility on that, but wow, just watch this.
Here's what I think is going to happen. I think he's going to find a way to end this war in a fashion that Putin would be a fool to do it again. Very quickly. How do you deter Putin? You arm this guy to the teeth. Yeah, you give him a bunch of F-16s, not a few F-16s. You give him ATACMS, you give him tanks, because they will fight. Remind me not to invade Ukraine, okay?
Wow. Yeah, they'll fight. They've been doing it for 3 years now, and they've been dying in profound numbers for 3 years now. There's somewhere around, depending on who you want to talk to, over 1 million casualties on the Ukraine side. A vast majority of those have been killed. And we don't even, of course, nobody has concrete numbers, and that's held as a state secret. But a lot of analysts, using many external pieces of evidence, say that that's probably a pretty plausible number. And then the number of amputees and seriously wounded and people who can't go back could also be way north of 1 million. The casualty count and the impact on the Ukrainian nation of having really an entire generation of men just wiped out and taken off the table here is profound. And for Lindsey Graham to be talking so callously, as he has done many times, about, just send in a bunch of more stuff and let's just keep the war going, and as though that Putin would be afraid. And just stop for a second and think about the irrational position with what Graham is saying there. I don't know if he believes any of this stuff. Part of me fears that he does, but even if he just is using it in a rhetorical way, it's just as bad, because the outcome is going to be the same. To suggest that you can send a whole bunch, and I actually saw 160 was the number that some are tossing around, 160 F-16s, not just a handful, 6, I think is all that's been delivered up to this point, maybe a handful more, but no more than that. Obviously, if you pay any attention, you know that the issue is not the platforms themselves, but you have to have trained pilots, and you have to have an entire infrastructure of support and maintenance and supplies that also undergirds that. You can't just ship a bunch of planes in there and think you're going to make a difference. They're not going to. And that does nothing to diminish the Russian air defense systems, which are very lethal to F-16s or any other aircraft, as we've seen play out in this war. Just like every aircraft can be subject to air defense missiles on the other side, to include the Russians. So that's not going to make any difference. And look, even if you thought it might, and it says, lots of tanks and all kinds of armored vehicles, etc. What is that going to do? You've already seen them try it in the year 2023. They had more than a half a year to prepare. And at that point, all of the gates were wide open from all the allies in the West. Yes, here, have these tanks, artillery pieces, infantry fighting vehicles, other armored vehicles, tanks, MRAPs, AMX tanks from France. I mean, all kinds of vehicles. And they were utterly crushed on the first line of Russian defense, never penetrated. And there were 5 Russian lines of defense, and then they lost all of their offensive capacity. Now, what possible leverage does Senator Graham think that he's going to hand over to President Trump that's going to scare Vladimir Putin if we try and reprise that? But now then, Russia is much stronger than they were in 23 militarily. And Ukraine is much weaker because of the profound number of casualties, and all of the folks that had experience, they keep dying off. So while they may have institutional knowledge, every time they keep bringing people up, they keep dying. So the force itself, the guys who have to actually do the fighting, are basically where they're in what's called a churn situation. So the fighting formations themselves don't gain the experience because the formations keep getting destroyed, and then they bring up new ones and trying to form them from scratch. You can't do it, Senator Graham. That's the bottom line here. That's not going to help. It's not going to change anything. So let's just scratch that off the table. So there is none of the stuff that he's talking about there will have any positive impact at all on negotiations. It may have some negative consequences, which I'm going to talk to in a little bit later, but won't have any positive. Now, all of that is kind of contrasted by some of the other things that the United States leaders are saying. Namely, Pete Hegseth was talking about what is not going to be on the table.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
Now, that's what we've been saying from the outset, that if you keep going after these objectives that are irrational and not connected to reality, all you're going to do is increase the cost of the Ukraine side in its loss. An objective of analysis and assessment of the realities on the ground militarily overwhelmingly and conclusively reveal that the Russian side has won the war, past tense. The fighting is going on, but the outcome is already determined. Russia won, and the West and Ukraine lost. Now, that's abhorrent for so many in the West to contemplate, and you see so far they're not able to. In that clip there with Senator Graham, You may have heard when he said we should give them a bunch of this military stuff, and you hear somebody shout in the rear area, "Oh, here, here," and then claps and all that, because that's what people want in the West. We still can't come to grasp mentally that the war has been lost, already over. And they still want to give stuff. We've seen Keir Starmer in recent last couple of weeks say that, we're still going to get 100 years of support to the Ukraine. We're going to keep giving them more in 2025 than we did in all of the first 3 years of the war. That kind of thing, just detached from reality. And one has to wonder at some point where the reality will come, because it is coming. Understand this. The reality will be imposed upon us if we're not going to be able to acknowledge it just intellectually. Now, the fact that President Trump is in the White House right now instead of President Biden, who was totally unwilling to even contemplate anything like this, obviously, at least President Trump seems to be going down the right path. He's talking to Vladimir Putin, had a 90-minute conversation with him, apparently has subsequently had a 1-hour conversation with Zelensky. But then we have to get to, well, I think we might have a little bit of a clue what possibly was said in this. And so far, neither the United States or the Ukraine side are saying what was in those conversations or what they talked about. But let me show you a couple of how Ukraine is viewing some of this. Here is from the Kiev Post today, a headline that says, Gary, if you can toss that one up there about the 5 things you need to know. Munich Agreement, 1938, 2025, and appeasement. These guys are afraid already that Donald Trump is ready to sail them down the river. And they go in there and they try to make a number of comments about, the famous or infamous Munich Agreement in 1938, which basically ceded Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany and to Hitler. And now then they're trying to say that now then they're on the cusp of the same thing happening to Ukraine here. And there is no analogy of that, comparison to that, other than this city. The fact that these agreements are happening in the city. But there is no comparison. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which was an appeasement by the West to Hitler in an effort and a possibility of trying to stave off larger war. Now, history has been very bad to Neville Chamberlain, and his name is now synonymous with surrender and, giving in to whatever happened, all the stuff that happened after that. The fact is that Hitler was always going to attack. And, it's hard. It's easy to say in retrospect that was a mistake. But at the time and in the context, especially just 25 years from the millions that had died in World War I, it wasn't a completely irrational thing for him to do. At least give it a shot. But it didn't work out, and we all know what happened after that. But that was before and trying to prevent World War II. This, on the other hand, is after 3 years of war, and we're trying to end the war here. And that's the whole point here. As I keep saying, the objective analysis, taking emotion out of it, the war is over, so this needs to bring it to an end. If you bring it to an end now, a bunch of Ukraine people get to live. You can't undo the devastation that's happened already, and that's going to be a blot on the West and on the President Biden in particular. Many of the other European leaders, Boris Johnson also will carry specific, in particular, damaging views when he's looked at in history because of the unrealistic paths that they took and the certainty that with the death and destruction they caused on the Ukraine side. But now then we have a chance to stop it here. Or we can say we're going to ignore the reality on the ground. We're still going to try to seek an optimal outcome for the Ukraine side, which certainly Volodymyr Zelensky is radically trying to push hard, and we're going to see that in a second too. All that will do is prolong the war, increase the casualty count for the Ukraine side, and add to the territory that Russia will end up taking. That's where we are. That's reality. Let's find out how this is going to play out. Zelensky, for his part, also picked up on this 1938 Munich Agreement and says that, in fact, there's not going to be any agreement in Munich. He's not going to reach any deal here. Gary, if you can toss that second headline up there from Zelensky earlier today. This is from the Kiev Independent. He said a peace deal cannot be signed in Munich because, well, it's Munich. We remember things that were signed here. I do not repeat such things, Zelensky added, recalling the infamous Munich Agreement 1938. Zelensky said he was ready to meet the Russian president, but only after there is a joint plan with Trump and the European Union. I'm ready to meet only in this case, he said, and I will sit down with Putin and stop the war, Zelensky says. Now, listen, he keeps saying, all these conditions and requirements as though he has leverage power. He has power over Russia. He has none. So one has to wonder what is going to be the reaction from the Russian side. Now, before I show you that, because there is some that we can look at here, let me show you some of the else. So I've already shown you what Lindsey Graham had to say and what Vice President Vance had to say. But in Zelensky's ear, he's hearing other big names in America also saying stuff like what General Jack Keane says here.
Russia's hand in 2025 is going to be pretty weak. They just took 48,000 casualties last month and 48,000 casualties the month before. In October, it was 57,000. They've averaged throughout 24 about 30,000 casualties a month. I mean, that is absolutely staggering what I'm talking about here. And they lose 125 to 150 tanks a month, only able to replace about 25 and 30 out of the defense industrial base. He will have a personnel problem requiring mobilization in 25 if there's no agreement. And clearly, he is having major equipment shortfalls. There is huge amount of pressure. Plus, he's got everything on the table here in terms of his ability to continue in his presidency and his own personal survival.
I have no earthly idea where he's getting his numbers. There is no rational, independent assessment that Russia is suffering those kinds of casualties. 50,000 in a month? I mean, what is he talking about? You can see on the battlefield, you can see where the Russians continue to advance to the west. Now, if they're suffering these kinds of casualties, for the moment, let's just say, okay, he has secret information I don't have access to through his organization or through contacts, whatever. Let's for the moment say there. I doubt very seriously anything close to that is right. But in the event that he was right, what does he think the other side of that line is doing? If Russia is losing this many people and is allegedly not being able to replace all of its equipment losses, and I have severe questions about that. In fact, I have seen independent analysis that says to the contrary, Russia's armored force is being able to make up for its losses and is increasing stuff, because a lot of these that are called tank losses actually come back because they were retrofitted and repaired and brought back into action. So it's not just like once a tank is knocked out of the fight that the war is or that it's out of the war. Usually they come back, as a matter of fact. He doesn't mention any of that. And so to say it's only 25%, I just think that those are completely outlandish. And we see on the battlefield these things happen. We see where they are. They continue going on. But again, in the same categories, what does he think's happening on the other side? And he says that Russia can't maintain this. Well, if it was just a matter of looking at the Russian side, I guess theoretically that would be possible. At some point, they may run out of more. But it's not in isolation. There's two sides to the conflict. There are two sides on this. And the Ukraine side is losing even more because they're outgunned and they're outmanned. And they don't have the industrial capacity. Whatever limitations he claims the Russians have, Ukraine is profoundly less capable. So when you're talking about, that Russia's getting weaker, I mean, that's irrational. It's illogical, because the effect of all of these troops on the front line and all of the firepower and the air power and the air defense and everything, all of this together is just having catastrophic events. I've shown you many of the interviews with the Ukraine soldiers, with the Ukrainian commanding generals, saying that they can't recruit enough to offset losses. They're net losing all the time in manpower. Yes, Russia may have to add more difficulties in getting manpower. They're increasing bonuses and that kind of stuff, but it's working. So it doesn't matter whether it's harder. It only matters what they perform and what they produce. And they continue to offset losses, and they're still growing. And it's even worse than that. And I'll get to that in a little bit while as well. But so that's Jack Keane, a retired four-star general who allegedly knows something, who's either being deceptive or he's being badly misinformed. But one way or the other, he's illogical. And if Zelensky's listening to that, he's possibly going to make a bad decision. Well, Keane's not the only one. From that same interview I had with Lindsey Graham a minute ago, he also added this.
I want to tell you and your people, you're the ally I've been hoping for all my life. Not one American has died defending Ukraine. You've taken our weapons and you've kicked their ass. and I'm very proud to have you as our ally.
So you see, physically in his ear, exactly what I'm talking about right there. You have Zelensky hearing this praise from the United States, and he knows that Lindsey Graham is a close personal friend of Trump. So he knows that anything that, or he regards rather, anything he hears from Lindsey Graham as being synonymous with what the president may think. But to hear him butter him up and say, you have kicked Russia's ass. Really? What? You want to make that argument? You want to go there? So the entire calendar year of 2023, the Ukraine side broke its teeth on the Russian defenses, utterly failed in their offensive. The entire calendar year of 2024 was nothing but a movement to the west by the Russian side. And yes, there's not a big territorial gain as in terms of the country, but it is methodical. It's moving forward. But the big issue is what nobody in the West seems to get a handle on. Territorial access is not Russia's primary objective. Demilitarizing Ukraine is. And if they have these slow, methodical operations that continually grind down and destroy the Ukrainian military, and according to General Syrskyi, their operations are succeeding because the army is getting smaller. Once they get the army down to some unknown size, because it's different in every war, the Ukraine military could literally collapse and break. Then the whole territory is just wide open to the Russians if that's what they want to do. See, that's what the Russians are thinking. You're looking at it from the implication of, well, they haven't taken a lot of territory, so they're failing, but you're oblivious to all the casualties to the Ukraine military, and the Russia's strategic view is succeeding. Then there was one other one here, and I almost hesitate to show this. I haven't shown him in a while, but this is a really fresh commentary that just shows, again, how the so-called elite establishment in the United States and in the West just cannot get hold of reality.
He thinks he's winning right now because he can feel all this pressure in the West we got to negotiate. Why are we chasing the Russians to negotiate? The Russians are the ones that are much weaker now than they were a year ago. These casualties we've talked about, after a year of fighting, they have added a pitifully small amount of terrain. And I think, if your readers and listeners look at a map and see where Russia actually is, what they've accomplished since, let's say, a year ago, at enormous cost, that's the best they can do. And for the Russians, their only hope is that we quit. And I don't know why it's in our interest. When I say ours, I mean the United States, UK, France, Germany, Poland, anybody, why it's in our interest that Russia is rewarded for all of its aggression over the last 11 years by keeping Crimea and the 20% of Ukraine that they have captured.
Russia's only hope, says he, and that Russia is getting weaker and weaker, and that they're weaker now than they were before. I mean, can he not count? Does he not do math? First of all, on the military side, Russia in the last year has added, I think, somewhere between, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere around 300,000 total troops. And it might even be more than that at this point from where they were a year ago. So despite all the losses they've had, and they have had just tremendous number of casualties, it is huge. It's not minor. It is legitimate. But they have continued to add people above the loss rate. So the overall size of the force has gotten bigger. So just mathematically, that's complete ludicrous. Russia has gotten stronger, not weaker. You had a senior U.S. Army general last year concede, I think it was Cavoli. He said Russia is bigger, they're stronger, and they're more capable because they've learned a lot more on the battlefield. And their tactics are improving. Every category you want to look at, Russia is stronger, not weaker. And then economically, you have people saying that the United States should use economic leverage. You heard Hodges has also talked about how weak Russia is. I think Keene mentioned something about that. But then you look, this is the top 15 economies in Europe as of November 2024. Russia's number 5 on the list, folks. That's above Spain, Netherlands, Switzerland, Poland, Belgium, Sweden, Ireland, Austria, Norway. All these countries, Russia's above all of them. I think that depending on, again, who you look to count, I think Russia grew their economy at about 4% last calendar year. Did you see anybody else in Europe even come close to that? Germany is flat, and it probably are going to be technically in a recession pretty soon, the way things are going. And you want to talk about how Russia's weaker? So whether you're talking about economically or militarily, that's a lie. It's just factually untrue. And there's some things are opinions. You can give opinions on things. That's not one of them. So when you have these senior people telling Zelensky, and he's hearing this stuff, he's thinking, yeah, maybe I could. Maybe that's why he's making some of these decisions and demands on conditions that he'll have before he'll even talk. And in response to a lot of that, here's what Zelensky has been saying recently about where he is on this whole negotiation issue.
We have to save these minerals, and those countries, we are thankful to all the support, but those countries who will support us and who will save this, of course, they will have priority to invest in it, because we need jobs and investment, and then we will divide profits with one or another partner. So that was very important. Save it and don't give to North Korea, maybe China, I don't know whom Russia will and want to give it after occupation. We need to save it, critical minerals, and a lot of different things.
Okay, look, a lot of that, I had to listen to that a couple of times. And if you had a hard time following that, you're not alone. It's hard for me to really understand where he's going with that, what he's even trying to say. But the bottom line is he's not even talking about issues of war and peace. He's not talking about issues of negotiations. He's only saying to Trump, because he thinks that Trump is motivated as a businessman by cash, and definitely Trump has feeding that, because he said he wants $500 million worth of that stuff. It's unclear for what's happened in the past or what he may do in the future. It's unclear, but he's saying, yeah, I want access to those minerals. So you have Zelensky sitting there saying that doesn't have anything to do with the war that you're fighting, is the big thing. Then another clip I want to show you here. He's talking about a couple of different things. One, he's NATO, by now, everybody should understand, is off the table. But it doesn't seem like he does.
And we spoke with the President Biden, and we spoke with the President Trump, and especially now with the President Trump, I asked, so, okay, if it's not NATO for today, if it's not NATO, we will ask tomorrow, it doesn't matter. But if we're speaking about today, what alternatives? What you know, the alternatives? I don't know. What I see, if we don't have NATO, real NATO, we will make NATO in Ukraine. It means that we need to increase our soldiers, our army, twice. And we spoke with the President Biden, and we spoke with the President Trump, and especially now with the President Trump, I asked, so, okay, if it's not NATO for today, if it's not NATO, we will ask tomorrow, it doesn't matter. But if we're speaking about today, what alternatives? What you know, the alternatives? I don't know. What I see, if we don't have NATO, real NATO, we will make NATO in Ukraine. It means that we need to increase our soldiers, our army, twice.
Yeah.
I apologize. I ran that twice and I made a mistake. Give me 1 second and I'll have the other one loaded up.
Okay. Yeah. Now. Okay. Let's just look at that first one there by itself. He wants to have NATO. He's not going to get it. So then he's like, well, we'll make our own NATO and we'll start that out. And then we'll build it within our country. What does that even mean? NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Alliance of 32 members, none of which are Ukraine. So to build a NATO inside, that's a euphemism for an army. You've got an army. You have a NATO, but now he wants to expand it and double it. Where's he going to get the personnel from that? Listen, it shouldn't even need to be said, but I'll say it because he made the comment. You can't build an army on the fly while you've been invaded and to think it's going to be successful. You would need, and I'm not exaggerating at all, a decade to build an army from scratch that would have a chance on a modern battlefield against a peer competitor the size of Russia. It's shocking to me that there are so few experts, and some of them I've shown you are 3- and 4-star retired generals who should know better. And that, by the way, is an alarming issue for the United States itself, is that we don't, guys who have been at the highest levels don't seem to understand the basic fundamentals that a second lieutenant should have. But yet that's what they're saying. But regardless of what they don't know, let me make sure you're clear on here. You can't build the army that he said. You can't just double it now. I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, Zelensky also came out and said that they're going to completely change how they form their organization. They're now going to use army corps, which are composed of divisions and brigades, etc. And he's going to retool how they do it. What they've already changed several times. It doesn't make any difference because you don't have the manpower. And by that, I don't just mean the number of people. You can take a guy and grab him off the street, which Ukraine does every day, and throw a uniform on him. That's not a soldier, folks. That's a man in a uniform. To have a trained soldier takes years. And to have an organization and like at the platoon, company, battalion, brigade level takes many years to build, because all the key leaders, both enlisted and officer at each of those echelons, have to have years of experience and training and education to be able to effectively operate in combat. That's how it works. And so this myth that you can just put a bunch of guys in uniform and send them to France for some training or something, or German training centers, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't work that way. Zelensky is unaware of that. It's often said that he was a comedian, in his career before he went into politics. And it's true. He just doesn't have the knowledge, and everything he's done since then. Sure, he hears a lot of these things, but if you don't have a basic understanding and a fundamental education of how things work, you're never going to be able to overcome that when you're trying to give action. And seeing how the decisions he's made as a wartime commander have been hideous. They don't talk about that much in the West because we like to portray him as, Winston Churchill, then he's going to be the savior, whatever. And it's just bad form to acknowledge the obvious, that he's made some horrific decisions. I mean, we can go starting in Mariupol in 2022, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Krinky on the Dnieper River, just some hideous decisions. And what they're currently doing now, Chasiv Yar, all kinds of things. So many just bad decisions about how he conducted this warfare, and then just the personnel losses. So it's irrational. Now then, Gary, if you have that second one, go ahead and roll that one.
So if we speak security guarantees, we have to find money for a bigger army for Ukraine. And also we have to find possibility how to increase production and increase army in Europe. Who knows? Maybe it's common forces. I don't know. We are ready to speak.
Yeah. You see, again, this just doesn't make sense. This is what he's saying. This is today, folks. This is what he's saying right now. He's saying, I'm going to set the conditions that I will decide what we can have with Russia, when we can talk to them, where we can have a negotiated settlement. I'm gonna build my own NATO. You saw Piers Morgan a week or so ago. I want nuclear weapons. And Gary showed you, I think yesterday, a couple of headlines from some of his defense minister. We're still going to be in NATO, just oblivious to the fact that nobody with a sane mind is ever going to allow Ukraine into NATO. I'm talking about NATO members. Most assuredly, the President of the United States and his Secretary of Defense flat out said it, and they're just detached from reality. And listen, that's part of what we need to understand is going on here. I think it is to the point now, and this is not just a derogatory statement, not just a pejorative, but a real situation. The leadership in Ukraine is delusional. They are not able to have a rational conversation. You can't expect them to make common decisions. And, a lot of people are complaining that the Trump administration is looking like it's going to bypass Ukraine and go one-on-one with Moscow to reach an agreement with this. And they're saying that's a terrible thing. But listen, folks, if you don't have a rational actor on the Ukraine side, it's irrational to try and go through him to get an agreement to end the war. That's the harsh truth. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that. I know a lot of people who love Ukraine, and I sympathize with that strongly. I myself I think I love the Ukraine people as much or more than anybody who say they're behind them. But I've been advocating for policies that would have saved their lives. Who is going to benefit from this arrogance in this pride of saying, no, I'm not going to let somebody invade my country. If you keep fighting and dying to the tune of maybe over 1 million people and many hundreds of thousands at a bare minimum, shocking number, unnecessary. And if you keep fighting now, then Russia is going to be put in the position to where they'll just, okay, if that's your position, I get it, but we're going to keep fighting. And in fact, let's look a little bit at what the Russians have said, because here's a comment of what many of the Russians are saying after the announcement of the conversation between Trump and Putin.
Moscow also says that in those talks on Ukraine, Moscow will take into account the so-called eloquent experience that Russia had while there were negotiations in Minsk, because Moscow has been repeatedly saying that those talks in 2015, which ended the fighting between Kiev and the Donbas republics, which was at least aimed to do that, Moscow was betrayed, and there was never a genuine desire on the part of France or Germany, who brokered that deal, to actually stop the fighting, saying that was buying time to rearm Kiev. So now Moscow insists that the root causes of the Ukraine conflict have to be eliminated for any sort of lasting solution. But both sides do admit that there is the political will on both sides to actually work together and to find a solution. Moreover, they are insisting that this solution should be found on the basis of negotiations process. So at this stage, any ceasefire is not regarded as a prerequisite for a potential summit between the two presidents of the two countries.
Okay, a lot of important things that was revealed from the Russian side in that report there. Number one is they say no Minsk agreements, because they were burned in Minsk agreements. And just a really quick, if you're not familiar with that, that was Minsk, Belarus, where a city where the negotiations were held between France, Germany, United States, France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. And all those leaders signed this agreement that would have ended basically the civil war that had started in 2014. It was going to call for heavy weapons to be moved back from the line of contact, because that's where the civil war had been going on. And that Ukraine, one of the key requirements for Ukraine was that they would change their constitution to allow the Russian language to be used in the East, and would provide political autonomy for the Luhansk and Donetsk areas where the majority of the Russians were living, and they would no longer be oppressed. That never happened. The Ukraine side never did that. And of course, we know from Hollande and Angela Merkel subsequently to that they never intended it for it to be. They just wanted to buy time for the Ukraine side. So they didn't want to solve it. That's what Russia has in mind now. They're saying we've been down this rodeo before where we didn't get the issues resolved. We had a negotiated settlement with the West, but they never implemented it. Now then they're in a position where they're saying, we're not going to go down that path again. We're going to continue going forward. There won't be a ceasefire. That's the second thing that she said there that is important to understand. There's not going to be a ceasefire. And many in the West think there is going to be a ceasefire. At least what's been reported is the Kellogg plan, Trump's special envoy to Ukraine-Russia war, has said that he wants a ceasefire, and they want to bring in troops to patrol it and all this kind of stuff. Apparently that's dead on arrival. The Russians aren't going to allow it. They don't want a ceasefire. Let me tell you why. Now, I just showed you all of that military balance of power between the two, irrevocably on the Russians' advantage. They know that. So Russia is signaling that they don't want another empty deal or a ceasefire that's only going to allow the Ukraine side to recover itself, to start getting more weapons, more training, start to train up more people, et cetera, over any period of time. Because if there's not a genuine political settlement that brings to an enduring peace, then they're not for that. They've been down this road before. And right now, this is crucial to understand. Right now, they have the military capacity to force the issue to their advantage. If they don't get the negotiated deal that they think is the minimum necessary for their security, they'll simply keep fighting. And we've seen this before. All the time, the Istanbul negotiations were going on in March and April of 2022. The fighting continued on. Russia was continuing to go in Mariupol and several other places all along the line of contact. The fighting never stopped then. And then when the negotiations broke down, they simply just continued on. But there was never a stop in the fighting. And so it was the same situation. Apparently there was some other discussions also with Turkey trying to broker some things in 2023. That went nowhere. But Russia, while they're talking, is still fighting. They're going to do the same thing here. They have no incentive to have a ceasefire and to have negotiations, because that would take a huge point of leverage out of their hand and just give it to Zelensky, because they want the pressure that you have to accommodate their terms, or we'll simply keep killing your people and taking territory. Meaning every week you delay is less territory you have and more of your people who die. That is the leverage that Putin has right now that the United States doesn't. Now, it appears from a comment from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth that he apparently does understand that, and the fact that he uses some similar language to what the Russians have said indicates that they may acknowledge reality. Here's how he put it.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Okay, now those two comments right there would definitely be picked up by the Russian side, because those are two of their key issues. NATO, in fact, in Ukraine was why they went to war in the first place. So if that's off the table, then Russia says we are willing to have negotiations. And if you say you don't want a Minsk 3.0, then you just heard that the Russians don't either, then that says that there is growing consensus between the two sides, meaning it's the band is narrowing to the difficulties of getting a negotiated settlement. But we have to understand that there are limitations. And I really liked one of the things that Secretary Hegseth said when somebody was asking him, aren't you betraying Ukraine? Aren't you just handing over? I think we showed you the other day, John Bolton said, Trump has surrendered before the talks even start. No, says Hegseth, we're not surrendering anything. This is simply a recognition of reality. And really, to me, that's a breath of fresh air, because if he's talking about something that's true and real on the ground, then we have a shot to get the last of that gap closed and end the killing. Trump has said that his objective is to stop the killing. I think it's important that he used that phrase, because that implies that we're not trying to get some concessions out of Russia that's going to be great for Ukraine, because those don't exist. But he's saying that we need to stop the killing, and the only way you're going to stop the killing is to recognize reality and then have something that the Russians can live with. Because here's the deal. The Russians have the power to take what they want. Maybe it'll take them a lot longer. Maybe they'll have another tens of thousands of casualties. That's entirely possible, and they'll pay it. That's what you need to understand. They have the military capacity, ammunition, equipment, air power, air defense, intelligence support, electronic warfare support, and above all, manpower. They have all of that, and they most assuredly have the political will, and they can take on the battlefield everything they want if they don't get into negotiations. It is entirely in America's national interest to end the war on the least offensive terms possible now. Because if we don't agree to the truly ugly terms that are being offered, then the truly uglier reality that Russia will later exploit and extract by force of arms on the battlefield will be much worse. It'll be worse for everyone. And listen, you saw, we had Zelensky himself admit about a week ago that his intelligence tells him that Russia is building up a big offensive force. He later said it was like 100,000 people, and that they have been, a lot of this equipment has apparently wasn't all of the new stuff that they've been making wasn't all going to the front. Some of it was going into storage shelters for use later. And now then, Zelensky has revealed that there could be several divisions, new divisions of Russian combat power that are ready to go forward. We also had Denmark. And this was, I think, just today. It was either today or yesterday. I can't recall. But Denmark has published what they said is Putin's plan, that he is building the combat power that is enough to actually take on NATO. And they said phase 2, which is just 2 years, would mean that they have the military capacity to actually conquer the Balkans if it goes that far. Now, so far, Putin is saying he wants security on his western flank, and he's willing to get it through negotiations where he can then have reestablish relations with the West and the United States and a security architecture that everybody can live with. That's what he's offering if we get a deal now. Listen, I don't know what their plans are. I don't know if Russia would actually go and do those things, but it's not unreasonable to suggest from their perspective, if they're unable to get acquiescence from the West, and I don't think they even consider Zelensky anymore, but if they get acquiescence from the West and they can get by negotiation some kind of a deal that they can feel that they can actually live with, and it won't be a Minsk 3.0, if they don't get that, they are building the capacity that they could make good on that. They could. And just imagine how much worse that would be. Because if Russia says, all right, we're going to take care of our western flank here in Ukraine, but now we're also going to take care of the northwestern part of our flank in the Baltics. And listen, I said this at the time, and I'll repeat it again here. When we brought the Baltics into NATO, that looked good on paper. It was kind of an in-your-face deal, and everybody's going, yeah, we're getting bigger. And now we've added in Sweden and Finland and all that kind of stuff. And everybody says, yeah, we're getting tougher, and that's scaring Putin. It's not. And let me tell you why. Militarily, if you look at a map, you can see there's this place called the Suwalki Gap in Poland, which is a very small band of territory that if the NATO should have to try and conventionally defend the Baltics, they would have to go all this narrow band. And I'm just telling you, in modern warfare, we've seen how Russia can build a defensive line that can shut that thing off in a heartbeat. They know how to do that. And it would be nearly impossible for the West to mount an offensive that could go and rescue the Balkans because Russia's right there. And by the way, if you've ever looked at a spreadsheet, the Baltic militaries are really small. And they, of course, they have no combat experience. They haven't done that in a long time. They're not ready for war right now. Russia is. And in the event that they rolled up into the north, the only thing we could do to stop them would be go to nuclear war. And I'm just telling you, it's a gamble because it could backfire, but it's possible that Russia may make that move, calculating that Paris, London, Rome, Washington would not sacrifice their own cities to defend the Baltics. That and if Russia makes that gamble, that's the position that the presidents of those countries would be in. Do we go to war with Russia and have them use nuclear weapons? And we couldn't stop it. None of us could stop it. And of course, we would fire nuclear weapons back. So Russia itself would be destroyed or vaporized. But would we be willing to say, yes, let's have everyone be killed just because they've gone into the Balkans? I don't think that's a safe bet. And even though we all love in the West to say, yes, Article 5 means that, Russia will never do anything because they know that it would be suicide for them. Ben Hodges makes this argument all the time. But they always forget about the other half of that equation, that we also would be buried under Russian nuclear weapons and our countries would be obliterated. Our millions, tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions in our case, of our citizens would be vaporized. Would our leaders do that? Would we take a step that's going to a certain knowledge that there'll be a nuclear weapon coming back for the sake of the Baltics? I doubt seriously that would happen. If I was president, I wouldn't do it. I would hate that had happened, but I'm not going to sacrifice millions of my own citizens because of what happened on the ground conventionally there. And we are taking a huge gamble to think that Russia would never take that move, because I think that they might, if it gets down to it, to obviate that and to make that so that never comes up and stays in the theoretical realm. We need a negotiated settlement now on the best ugly terms that we can get. It doesn't matter what Volodymyr Zelensky says, he's detached from reality. I'm just telling you, he's got to be taken out of the equation here. This has got to be between Trump and Putin. And if it is, then there is a reasonable chance that we can get the rest of that gap narrowed down until we can get some kind of an agreement. And people can be upset about it all they want afterwards, and they can complain and moan. Fair enough. That's a democracy, and it's ugly, and people can say whatever they want to. But if we don't do that, then much, much worse becomes not just theoretical, but in the distinct realm of possibility. And that's what I desperately want to see happen, that we avoid those worst outcomes and just take the ugly end right now and don't ever have to face the possibility of a catastrophic outcome. That's your deep dive for today. Really appreciate you guys today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't. And, as events continue to happen, as a lot of these meetings are still going on in Munich and are expected to continue on, and more information will come out. We'll get back to you then. Thank you very much, though. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.